In the early 1980s, Conan the Barbarian cracked the door open, and low-budget studios kicked it off the hinges. What followed were R-rated knockoffs starring bodybuilders, twin models, chainmail bikinis, rubber demons, stolen sets, and fantasy plots that barely qualify as movies. And somehow, people never stopped watching them. Deathstalker, 1983. Deathstalker is where restraint went to die. This is the movie every producer wanted to make after seeing Conan succeed. Fast, cheap, violent, and unapologetically sleazy. Roger Corman didn't just greenlight a sword and sorcery film here. He unleashed a template that dozens of knockoffs would follow without shame. The plot barely holds together. A warrior named Deathstalker wants a magical sword, a chalice, and revenge, not necessarily in that order. He wanders from kingdom to kingdom, encountering evil sorcerers, sadistic nobles, and women who exist almost entirely to be framed provocatively by the camera. What makes Deathstalker infamous isn't just the nudity or the violence, it's the tone. The film doesn't build toward heroism, it drifts, scenes end abruptly, characters disappear, moral lines blur to the point of meaninglessness. And yet, it works. Because Deathstalker understands something crucial. Audiences watching these movies weren't looking for mythology. They were looking for chaos. The film leans into exploitation so aggressively that it becomes hypnotic. The fights are clumsy, the effects are cheap, but the commitment is absolute. This is the Conan knockoff in its purest form. Tasteless, ridiculous, and permanently burned into VHS history. Sorceress, 1982. If Deathstalker was crude, Sorceress was openly deranged. Another Roger Corman production, Sorceress feels less like a fantasy film and more like a dare. The premise centers on twin sisters born under a magical prophecy, bound together by fate, power, and a camera that refuses to leave them alone. The story gestures toward epic conflict, evil sorcerers, royal bloodlines, dark magic. But it's all window dressing. The real engine of the film is excess. Scenes exist purely to escalate shock value. Costumes seem designed to dissolve under studio lights. Violence appears suddenly and disappears just as fast. What separates Sorceress from lesser knockoffs is how far it pushes discomfort. Even by early 80s exploitation standards, this movie feels unfiltered. It's awkward, it's ugly, and it never pretends otherwise. That honesty is why it survived. Decades later, Sorceress isn't remembered as a failure. It's remembered as an experience, a midnight movie artifact from a time when fantasy cinema had absolutely no shame left to lose. Conquest, 1983. Then there's Conquest, the moment when Conan knockoffs stopped pretending to be fun. Directed by Lucio Fulci, Conquest feels less like a fantasy adventure and more like a nightmare someone filmed before waking up screaming. The plot exists only in fragments. A warrior, an evil queen, monstrous creatures, endless suffering. But structure isn't the point. The violence here is brutal, lingering, and mean-spirited. Eyes are destroyed, bodies are mangled. The monsters look less like creatures and more like walking infections. Fog blankets everything, making the world feel rotten and unstable. There is no triumph in Conquest, no catharsis, just movement through misery. And that's exactly why it became legendary. This is sword and sorcery filtered through European horror. A genre collision that produces something deeply uncomfortable and unforgettable. It's not entertainment in the traditional sense, it's endurance cinema. For some viewers, Conquest is unwatchable. For cult fans, it's sacred. Barbarian Queen, 1985. Barbarian Queen arrives disguised as exploitation and never fully escapes that label. But there's more happening beneath the surface. The film tells the story of a woman whose village is destroyed and whose life is violently shattered. What follows is a brutal journey of survival and revenge through a world that offers no mercy and no safety. This is not a clean empowerment narrative. The film constantly contradicts itself. It exploits the very trauma it tries to condemn. Scenes meant to shock often feel cruel rather than meaningful. And yet, there's anger here. Real anger. Unlike most Conan clones, Barbarian Queen isn't about destiny or conquest. It's about endurance. About refusing to disappear. About fighting back in a world designed to erase you. That tension between exploitation and sincerity is what kept this movie alive. Viewers didn't just watch it, they argued with it, remembered it, passed it along on battered tapes late at night. It's messy, it's uncomfortable, and it refuses to be forgotten. Deathstalker 2, 1987. By the time Deathstalker 2 arrives, the genre knows it's a joke and leans into it hard. The sequel abandons any attempt at seriousness. The hero cracks jokes. The film winks at the audience. Fantasy tropes are exaggerated to the point of parody. It's still violent, still cheap, still ridiculous, but now it's self-aware. The result is strangely charming. Deathstalker 2 feels like a party thrown in the ruins of a collapsing genre. The sets look worse. The stakes are lower. The humor is juvenile, but the energy is infectious. It's Conan knockoff cinema laughing at itself and surviving because of it. The Barbarians, 1987. If most Conan knockoffs felt cheap, The Barbarians feels unreal. This movie stars real-life twin bodybuilders who look like they were sculpted specifically for VHS box art. Dialogue is minimal. Subtlety is non-existent. Logic left the building before the first reel finished. The twins are separated as children, raised apart, and reunited through destiny, muscles, and excessive screaming. Their enemies are cartoonishly evil. Their strength is supernatural. Their emotional range barely survives the runtime. And yet, The Barbarians became iconic. Not because it's good, because it's pure spectacle. This is fantasy cinema reduced to its dumbest, loudest components. Explosions of action, endless fights, bright colors, absurd stunts. It plays like a live-action comic book written by someone who skipped the plot panels. On cable TV, this movie was unstoppable. You didn't need context. You didn't need to start at the beginning. You just dropped in, watched two massive men destroy everything, and stayed until the commercial break. It's idiotic. It's unforgettable. And it represents the exact moment where the genre stopped pretending it had dignity. Warrior and the Sorceress, 1984. Warrior and the Sorceress is what happens when someone watches Seven Samurai once and decides to remake it with barbarians, nudity, and no budget. The premise is simple. A mysterious warrior arrives in a desert town torn apart by rival warlords. He plays both sides against each other, manipulating the conflict for his own purposes. Sound familiar? It should. This is Akira Kurosawa filtered through exploitation fantasy. The structure is stolen wholesale, but the execution is sleazy, violent, and unapologetically cheap. The town feels empty. The politics make no sense. The women are treated as prizes rather than people. And yet, there's something hypnotic about it. The pacing is slow. The desert landscapes feel endless. The violence is blunt and ugly. It's not exciting in the traditional sense, but it's strangely absorbing, like watching a genre cannibalize itself. This movie didn't find an audience in theaters. It wasn't meant to. It found its home late at night, where logic mattered less than atmosphere. Hundra, 1983. Then comes Hundra, a film that absolutely does not belong next to the others, and somehow still does. At first glance, it looks like another exploitation fantasy, but Hundra is colder, harsher, and far more serious than its peers. There's little humor here, little spectacle, little comfort. The story follows a woman raised in isolation, forced into a violent world that punishes her independence at every turn. The film explores survival, autonomy, and revenge, not as fantasy thrills, but as brutal necessities. This is not a crowd pleaser. The violence is disturbing. The tone is bleak. The camera refuses to romanticize what's happening. And because of that, Hundra failed completely on release. Audiences weren't ready for a fantasy film that refused to entertain them. Decades later, it's reevaluated as one of the most serious and unsettling entries in the entire Conan knockoff era. A film that accidentally smuggled real themes into a trash genre. Ator, The Fighting Eagle, 1982. If Hundra was too serious, Ator swings violently in the opposite direction. This is Italian knockoff cinema at its most unhinged. The plot barely exists. The dialogue feels improvised, and the hero looks confused most of the time. And so should you. There are spider cults, giant creatures, incest subtext that nobody acknowledges, musical cues that feel stolen from other films, and a general sense that the movie was assembled without a script anyone fully understood. And that's the appeal. A tour doesn't try to make sense. It exists as a collage of fantasy imagery held together by sheer momentum. Scene after scene arrives without explanation, dares you to accept it, and moves on before you can ask questions. This movie didn't succeed because it was competent. It survived because it was unfiltered. Pure VHS era madness. The kind of film you discover accidentally and never forget. Amazons, 1986. By the time Amazons appears, the genre is on its last breath. This is late stage Conan knockoff cinema, cheap, savage, and stripped of all illusion. The budget is microscopic, the performances are rough, the violence is blunt and repetitive, but Amazon still found a home. It played endlessly on late night TV, filling time slots when networks needed something loud, colorful, and disposable. And in that environment, it thrived. The movie feels raw, almost desperate. It's fantasy cinema made by people who knew the era was ending but kept going anyway. There's no polish here, no pretense. Just swords, blood, and movement until the tape runs out. And that's how the genre ends, not with dignity, but with persistence. These movies weren't mistakes, they were symptoms. A brief, chaotic moment in film history where studios chased success without understanding it, and creativity spilled out sideways. Where budgets were low, censorship was loose, and nobody stopped to ask if any of it made sense. They were too violent, too dumb, too tasteless, too strange. And that's why they survived, because long after respectable fantasy faded, these films stayed alive. On VHS shelves, cable reruns, and in the memories of people who discovered them way too young, way too late at night. They went off the rails, and somehow that's exactly where they belonged.